You're watching the DSP Leaders Summit on the Cloud Native Telco. I'm Guy Daniels, Director of Content at Telecom TV. Today's panel discussion is on how to operationalize cloud native deployments. The message from last year's inaugural event was clear. Stop talking, now put it into practice. But of course, that is far easier said than done. Let me introduce our guests for the next half hour or so, and I'm delighted to say we are joined today by Beth Cohen, SDN Product Strategies with Verizon, Paul Miller, Chief Technology Officer at Wind River, Swaminathan Venkataraman, who is Product and Solution Architect CMS at Hewlett Packard Enterprise, and Heather Kirksey, VP Community and Ecosystem Development with the Linux Foundation. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us on the program today.
Thanks for having us.
Hello, Guy.
Thanks very much for having me. Hello.
Now, last year's event saw many telcos wanting to move on from the why we should use cloud native discussion and to the how exactly do we do it discussion. So my first question to all of you really is, are we there yet? Are we yet seeing cloud native telco deployments? And if so, where? Swami, let me come to you first with that.
So thanks, Guy. Yes, definitely we are seeing cloud native telco deployments, especially in 5G. It is a fundamental requirement that all the network functions are cloud native and are services based and use a services based architecture. We have significant deployments that are ongoing across multiple geographies. In fact, in one instance, we have exactly now end-to-end 5G call flow testing that is occurring. Network functions are deployed in a cloud native environment and integrated using open services-based interfaces. We expect production deployments to occur at the end of the year, and definitely things to get actually operationalized and fully functional end of the year, beginning next year. So yes, at least on 5G related deployments, we see cloud native, and we definitely see a service-based architecture as a fundamental requirement.
Thanks. And Beth, you joined us for last year's event. What are you seeing now? Are we at a stage now where the situation's improved and we are seeing more operationalized deployments?
It's definitely improved. As was mentioned, the 5G is of course first with cloud native. But I'd still say we are definitely not in full production yet. But we are definitely moving in the right direction. It's definitely been a big improvement since last year.
That's always good to hear. Paul, what's your viewpoint on this? What are you seeing in the market now?
Thanks, Guy. Well, so we're definitely seeing a shift towards actual deployment now. As you're aware, your viewers may be aware, there was a recent press release from Verizon that talked about some of the work we're doing there, including the nation's first 5G fully virtualized call, and that was a cloud native implementation with partnership with Intel and Samsung, for example. And so we are seeing some significant traction there, and it really does make sense relevant to where the network architecture is today. Obviously, in the core of the network, we still see a predominance of virtual machines, right, in NFV infrastructure. But as we move towards the edge of the network, especially where new applications are being built, they're being built and deployed in a fully cloud native architecture because they're being built with the latest current technology. And so we're seeing the emergence of deployments around technologies like 5G and MEC in those types of carrier networks as well.
Great. And Heather, from your position at the heart of the developer community, what are you seeing now in terms of cloud native deployments?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that I think is sort of helping folks get close to operationalize and have successful deployments is some of the work that we're doing with CNTT, OpenFV, the CNCF Telecom User Group. Where we've been writing, Beth has, I think, been involved in this, but we've been writing specifications and requirements and discussing architecture for there and sort of figuring out how that can feed into a compliance and verification program, both for infrastructure and for CNFs. And so, we're getting a lot of that written down and a lot of that figured out, as well as lots of proof of concepts going on and field trials and that kind of stuff through the open source community. So seeing a lot of excitement and a lot of participation by operators really looking at operational challenges as opposed to sort of the more early on very R&D kind of focused mindset. So now it's really how do we get that out there and how do we do it together in a way that makes business sense.
So I was going to add to that, what's really coming out of the CNTT work is that, we've identified the gaps and we are working with the CNCF teams to really start backfilling them so that it can move into be more operational in support of the telecom workloads. So,
Swami, what are the challenges that are holding back cloud native deployments?
I think it's a very good question. And as you said, and it is now time that we walk the talk, right? We've talked about cloud native. Now it's time to actually operationalize it. What we are seeing is that as we get into these kind of deployments, the first friction that we see is to be able to get to a good platform that can run on multiple infrastructures. So there are different distributions. Looking at compatibilities is one important factor in what you choose and how you deploy. The next sort of challenges that we see is the complexity in automation, in complexity in simplifying the installation, configuration, lifecycle management, and so on. Because at this point in time, you are moving from just talking about it to actually installing it, configuring it, operating it, and that's where simplicity is very important. We see complexity there that needs to be addressed. Also, there is departure right from the existing tooling that one is used to in terms of monitoring, or now as called as observability, visibility, and so on. So there is a departure from existing tooling, techniques, which there is new things to learn. And then the biggest thing that we see is when you go to cloud native, you need to really embrace the change that it brings in how you create a carrier-grade deployment and how you deploy it right from edge to core, right? And I think it was being mentioned before, is that these are different profiles, different topologies that need to be addressed. And to make it simple on automating it and deploying it in web scale is really a challenge, right? Both culturally and how you actually simplify it. Then there is the concept of DevOps, CI/CD that also comes in, and that brings a cultural change in how you continuously and incrementally deliver value into or features into the network and how you get them running, especially when the standards are new and evolving. Last but the least, I think security is also a big thing, right? Especially cloud native brings new vulnerabilities, new attack surface. There is a need to restrict that blast radius. So these are the different challenges, and if you want to summarize it, you could summarize it as the platform, automation, observability, and security. I think these are the areas where I think there is a definite focus, and there is a focused effort to simplify that areas. And the faster we simplify that, I think the reduced friction will be to actually adopt and put cloud native deployments into production.
Thanks, Swami. Paul, I'll come to you now. How are you seeing the challenges that are holding back cloud native deployments?
Yeah, thanks, Guy. It's actually a really great question. There's been a few intersecting requirements that have emerged as we've brought cloud native to the forefront. One is that a lot of the applications, as we talked about, things like 5G and MEC, they really implement a highly distributed architecture, right? Where we've had virtualization before, it's largely been self-contained in one data center and maybe multiple data centers that are tied together in a WAN. As we look at a cloud native implementation driven by specific use cases, such as the ones I mentioned, you've effectively brought to bear the need to, for the first time ever in a telco network, build tens of thousands of sites that are all tied together into one operational cloud environment, one fully virtualized topology from the edge all the way to the core. And that brings to bear some significant operational challenges. We look at things like zero-touch deployment and zero-touch provisioning. As you're turning up hundreds of sites a week, even to thousands, you need a fully automated environment in which to do that. And as Swami mentioned, things like CI/CD for software delivery to keep that infrastructure up to date, and to do so in an environment that is fully automated, including the update of that software infrastructure. So things like single pane of glass to be able to watch that highly disaggregated infrastructure from a centralized NOC, right? To be able to operationalize that with a low cost from a human resources perspective from the operator is really important to the service provider. And the last piece is once you've got it deployed and running, you really need a set of what we call day two capabilities so that you can operationalize that environment, pull data out of the infrastructure, get a kind of a big data analytics and AI and ML capability to watch that infrastructure and predict outages before they occur. So there's really an emphasis because of these use cases in the distributed cloud environment that's being built to really provide a large amount of automation and operational tools to be able to make it feasible to deploy.
Great. And Beth, you started off our conversation by saying that, we're seeing actual cloud native deployments, but we need to see more. So we're only starting. So there's obviously challenges here. Are these challenges, a step change above what we as telcos normally have to deal with?
Yes, there's no question. It's a whole different way of thinking about operations. It's the analogy that I typically use is when we moved to a virtualized environment, operations had to think about the disaggregation of hardware and software. So now operations has to take it to the next step and disaggregate the microservices from the hardware and the underlying systems. So that's yet another difficulty that the operational people have to think about in terms of how they monitor things, how they react to things. So that net DevOps mindset is something that takes them a little while to get into. So we are definitely moving in the right direction on that, but telcos take a while. Telcos tend to be fairly conservative. Yes, we are definitely technology companies, but we also are running very large networks that our customers rely on to run 100% of the time. So we have to be very careful when we deploy new technologies that they work.
Exactly. Telcos aren't known for their speed, but as you say, they've got a lot of reliability and requirements that they need to ensure. Heather, given all this, what are the best practices that are emerging to help telcos to actually operationalize cloud native?
Yeah. Well, one thing I want to say is that it's really exciting to hear all these people sort of on the panel talking about CI/CD. Guys, I think I've talked about CI/CD in pretty much every conversation I've had with you for a while. So it's exciting to kind of see that really beginning to take root. And the operators and thinking through how to use CI/CD to keep things up to date, how to have more smooth and more automated deployment. So I think that's really exciting. Certainly, I think, from a telecom usage of cloud native, I think the sort of, coming to groups like the Linux Foundation, LF Networking, to help, come up with compliance and verification plans. I think that's sort of very exciting so that we don't do anything that's going to slow down adoption or deployment, but we have a sort of community resource that everyone can participate in on an equal basis that can create a programmatic systematic infrastructure or sort of program that so people can feel comfortable with the infras and applications coming in. And then obviously, one of the best practices I'm going to advocate is getting involved in some of the work that we were talking about earlier, like CNTT, OPNFV, the Telecom User Group, to talk with your peers and to help get some of those kind of specifications and requirements documents and supporting tool sets and integration work actually sort of done so not everyone is having to do it on their own or just pairwise with a specific vendor or with a group of vendors, but really have that as an industry asset that we can all leverage going forward.
Yeah, so it's get involved with the community. Very good advice. Swami, any other best practices that telcos can adopt as they look to operationalize cloud native?
Yeah, I think the best practices also come from addressing the problems or the challenges that we just discussed. And I fully agree with everybody on the panel when they talk about CI/CD, automation, and so on. So actually, we are beginning to see right now conversations where the deployments are being talked about how we run this rather than where we run this, right? So that's a very important step forward, right? So we are trying to actually understand that there are use case driven deployments that need to be done, which means that not all features are required for all use cases. So the approach that is being taken, very interestingly, is not a big design upfront kind of approach. So what we are at least experiencing is that there is a very focused effort to actually have an agile, intentional architecture in place, which means that, like Heather was mentioning, using CI/CD, as Beth was mentioning, to make sure that whatever is being deployed can be trusted. You have full visibility, you have full control, and you're only incrementally deploying it. And that is where CI/CD, containers, microservices, cloud native actually helps you a lot. And taking that a bit further and having method of procedures, mops actually, and blueprints on how to deploy it from edge to core is where we are seeing actual work happening now, right? And automation cannot exist in a vacuum, right? We talk about web scale automation and such, but eventually this has to coexist and integrate with existing orchestration, be it NFV or be it other kind of orchestrations that are already existing, also including network slice management and so on. So we are beginning to see convergence and integration, interoperability, or you can say just plain integration between web scale automation and existing orchestration methods. We just got off, integrating observability, which is cloud native, into existing assurance stacks. So we're beginning to see best practices on what logs, what frequency, how should we do alarming, and so on and so forth in this new world, right? So there are best practices coming out of that challenge as well. And last but not the least, the service over infrastructure approach to deploying high performing, scalable, resilient systems in cloud native is something unique to a telco, right? This is not something you see in every enterprise. So taking cloud native, but mapping it to carrier grade deployments using service over infrastructure approach, applying pets versus cattle or geo redundancy based on profiles. So we are seeing multiple such fronts opening up in terms of best practices, and we expect that to only mature. But again, as I said, the challenges that are actually in front of us is where actually best practices are coming, and some are very unique to telco, which you cannot see anywhere else. So while we have a responsibility to build highly resilient, anti-fragile systems, we also need to do it in such a way that we release it faster. So that is where cloud native meets telco kind of robustness, and we are seeing a lot of actually best practices coming out. It will only improve.
I just want to pick up on that one with Paul. Obviously, we're seeing ways to operationalize and best practices coming from other industries, coming from the enterprise sectors. But are we also learning as we go along? Are telcos and carriers learning and creating their own bespoke ways of operationalizing?
Yeah, that's certainly an interesting question. Thanks, Guy. One of the things I'd say is that you cannot talk about this cloud native topic, as Beth mentioned earlier, without talking about open source, right? And that is the foundation of everything that we're doing here. I think it's key when we talk about operationalizing these technologies to not forget that open source consortia and activity, that crowdsourced innovation, is where a lot of these tools and techniques are coming from, where the expectations are about how we operationalize these environments. And in particular, we're very active in one called Starling X, which is hosted under the OpenStack Foundation, but is a fully CNCF certified Kubernetes foundation. It's a full cloud native implementation. And the reason for that open source activity is really to address particular concerns around operationalizing cloud native infrastructure. In using best practice technology like Kubernetes, Docker container runtimes, et cetera, Calico networking, all the pieces that go into an open source framework that's used for these technologies, you have to operationalize it, right, to your point. And the tools that come from that innovation, as I mentioned earlier, single pane of glass and software automation, things like CI/CD that was just talked about, and DevSecOps practice, right? We don't see those becoming proprietary implementations or bespoke to a particular service provider. Certainly, each service provider has their own methods and procedures that they use to operationalize their environment. But largely, we're talking about leveraging the crowdsourced innovation and tool sets that are used to operationalize that environment, to provide high levels of automation, to pull software down and perform software updates, to manage a highly distributed system. We look at this across several domains. We look at development, deployment, operations, and service. Obviously, these cloud native infrastructures, there's a development angle here where you have to have the right complete integrated tool set, as well as a CI/CD methodology to downstream that software from either an infrastructure or an application perspective down into the service provider. From the deployment angle, you've got to be able to stand up and deploy the systems, right? And looking at open source and operations practices within the service provider to make that successful. And then operations is really about the day two operations mindset. Once you have this deployed, you have to keep it up and running at 6 nines, and you have to make sure that you can continue to update that infrastructure with CI/CD. And then services as well, especially around DevSecOps. We use the term DevSecOps more than we use DevOps now because of the intrusion of security concerns across these networks. If you look at a far edge 5G deployment where you've got now a cloud element, a cloud native component sitting at the far edge of the network that's in a less secure infrastructure than a full-blown data center, this creates new security requirements that both the technology and the operational practices that the service provider need to address.
Thanks, Paul. And Beth, you're nodding away as Paul was talking there. Are you seeing security as an increasing concern?
Well, there's several things. One, Swami mentioned the orchestrator of orchestrators. So we probably have about 3 or 4 orchestrator systems out there, and we are working on aggregating them because, again, for efficiency reasons and operational reasons. And then, of course, security is always paramount to any telco. Absolutely, we build that right into anything. Any of our systems have to be certified for security. We do full testing of that security. Our customers demand it. We demand it. And so that just has to be built in from the ground up. I think CNCF, because it came out of the web cloud community, didn't pay a huge amount of attention to security early on. So and networking as well. So we're now kind of backfilling. We're needing to go back in and add those features and functionality, which for better or worse, that's the way it is. But fortunately, we are recognizing that it needs to be put in, and through the open source communities, we are actually adding it today. So that's the good news.
That is good news indeed. And Heather, as Beth was saying, we're kind of backfilling telco-specific requirements. Paul was talking earlier about Starling X, and the Linux Foundation has a number of its own hosted cloud native initiatives. Is it a two-way? Is it two-way traffic with the telcos? They're not all just taking out, are they? Are telcos actually putting back in sufficiently and contributing?
Yeah, no, they definitely are. And in some cases, it's things that, might be relatively specific to telco, but sometimes it's innovation that's coming. I think, as Swami was saying, as we experience challenges, Beth mentioned, sort of identifying gaps, that you see some really interesting things actually going into, for example, CNCF that initially started with operators, things like network service mesh. You see sort of input into, CNI and various other networking projects and service mesh projects in CNCF that are coming from the telcos. There's also work going on in ONAP. Orchestration was mentioned, and so we've been looking at sort of improving the cloud native capabilities of ONAP and getting that tied into cloud native infrastructures. So there's definitely a lot of active innovation actually coming from our communities as well that can be leveraged by some of the folks, who initially started in the cloud native world, as well as, things that help more seamlessly tie in, cloud native, that can be used in more of like an enterprise or web scaler type way into the telecom use cases. So definitely seeing a lot of that. It's exciting.
Great. Well, I'm going to ask a final question to all of you for some brief comments to wrap this up, because this is all about operationalizing cloud native deployments. Paul, first one to you. What can we do as an industry collectively? How can we encourage more cloud native deployments? What more can we do?
I think we have to unblock obstacles to operationalizing the infrastructure. as well as ensure that the applications that we're looking for are built to a cloud native requirement set. So Beth mentioned earlier microservices, for example, right? That's a very contemporary practice used in software architecture that really embraces the founding principles of what a cloud native infrastructure can provide. And some of the benefits there are pretty incredible. So if we see the applications moving towards a microservices architecture built on cloud native principles, you're starting to build applications that then need a place to land, right? And that infrastructure then becomes the cloud native infrastructure. And then, of course, this operational component that has been a thread throughout our entire discussion today. It's one thing to have a stack of servers running Kubernetes, right? It's a whole different thing to run a 6 nines high availability network, which has emergency 911 services, high availability requirements, serviceability requirements, and the ability to run that as a service provider is a daunting task, right? And so I think that we as vendors and as the open source community have to make contributions recognizing that that's what we're going into. It's not just a pure cloud native technology space. It has a severe operational component. Is really it's a lifeline service effectively, right? And you have to respect that and understand that not only do we make contributions in underlying technologies such as Kubernetes, but we provide the operational tool sets and automation and CI/CD that we've talked about today that ensure that can actually be deployed. So once you have these two things, a development paradigm that embraces cloud native principles and a technology that it can land on and actually be operationalized in a service provider network, you've then unblocked the market, right, to really launching and growing this technology.
And Beth, what more can we do to encourage more cloud native deployments? And also, how can the open source community help?
One of the major obstacles to operationalizing this is tools that can support cloud native applications at scale over the WAN. So that's something that I think is a little behind. And that's something that I think that the open source community can definitely work on. And both telcos and the vendor community has to work on this together, because we do need to solve that problem for this to be successful in the telco ecosystem.
And Heather, what can the community do? What are our next steps?
Yeah. So I think. One thing is sort of, these challenges that are coming up, really hear sort of the input from the end user and start figuring out, how to build some of these solutions, like what Beth just mentioned, get projects going in the open source community, bring your developers to do development work there. I think a lot of us have said, right, this is open source. It's at the heart of it. So, we do need, folks active in the open source community to make sure that software, shared pool of software that we all depend on is robust and healthy and has lots of participation in it and can be maintained over the long term. So, I tend to be, get involved. There are a lot of ways to get involved, and you'll also learn a lot from your peers.
Great. And Swami, last word to you. What more can we do as an industry to encourage more cloud native deployments?
I think what we all need to recognize is that, as was mentioned by Paul, Beth, and Heather as well, is that open source is very important. It is fundamental to actually having a good, healthy ecosystem of choice points that we have with respect to cloud native implementations. But open source does not mean free, right? It means we still need to take it. We need to industrialize this in the telco space to reach 6 nines, 5 nines, and whatnot. So we need to be contributing probably back into certain areas where we actually need robustness. Beth mentioned networking. I think it's a very important point. There are other space as well in terms of storage and others where we can actually do a lot more. So while we are actually bringing inbound open source to actually use it, we also need to see how we can innovate back and contribute it back into the open source community to actually make it more available to everybody and reduce the friction in adoption of these technologies.
Thank you. Well, thank you to all of you, but unfortunately that's all the time we have now. For now, again, thank you all for joining us on the panel. A reminder that we have many more interviews, panel discussions and analysis programs as part of the Cloud Native Telco Summit. They are all here to view on Telecom TV. And if you're watching us live, then please stay with us and join our live Q&A program. If you have any questions for any of our guests, then do get in touch now via the Telecom TV website. But for now, thank you very much for watching, and we hope to see you again soon.